The Hearthfire Keeper. Alara awoke before the frost had surrendered to morning, as she always did. The stone floor of the hearth house was cool beneath her bare feet, but the warmth from the central flame, once a steady golden heart pulsing within the round hearth, barely reached her today. She stood still in the dim orange light, watching as the fire gave a tired flicker, then stilled again. Her breath formed pale clouds in the air. That had never happened inside the hearth house, not once. She crossed the room in silence, laying a hand against the ancient stone rim. It was warm, but only just. The flame used to glow so bright, the walls themselves seemed to hum with it. Villagers would linger long after their duties were done, basking in its kindness, sipping moldberry tea, or knitting beside the hearth. But lately, they had been leaving early, clutching their coats closer, saying it felt thinner, somehow. Alara pulled her shawl tighter and knelt beside the fire. She stirred the embers gently with the iron poker. A few sparks drifted upward like tired fireflies. No logs had been added overnight. She had seen to it herself before sleeping. No draft had snuck in. And yet, the flame had waned. Not gone, no. But it whispered now, where it used to sing. She reached into the hollow nook beneath the fire basin, where the old hearthstones kept their secrets. From behind a worn panel, she pulled out the keeper's ledger, a thick, leather-bound book whose edges glowed faintly in her hands. She turned past the generations of careful script. Records of the hearth's moods, flame height, ember fall, warmth radius, flicker quality, and, rarely, noted disturbances. Her own notes filled the last dozen pages, mostly steady. A few dim mornings, a couple muted evenings, all dismissed as bad wood or wind patterns. But this wasn't bad wood. She knew bad wood. This was something else. Alara stared into the fire. It blinked back, tired. From the first time she'd watched her grandmother whisper stories to the flames, she knew the fire wasn't just warmth. It was memory, emotion. It glowed with the love of gatherings, the tears of partings, the laughter echoing from a nearby oven. It lived off the soul of the village. And maybe, she realized, the village was forgetting how to feel. She stood slowly, the ledger clutched in one arm, her other hand gently touching a stone. The fire needed something no log could offer. Not anymore. If the flame was failing, she would not wait until it vanished. She would seek its kindling, wherever it still lingered. Lonely warmth still lived in the world. In quiet corners, in soft hands, in the forgotten. She just had to find it. Alara tucked the ledger into her satchel, along with a handful of copper-charred coals from the hearth's edge, embers still faintly alive, wrapped gently in waxed linen. She added a flask of snow-melt water, a hunk of rye bread, and a pair of wool gloves before tying her cloak at the neck. The sky outside the hearth house was a pale gray of waiting, the kind of light that made the day feel unsure of itself. She stepped into the till with her breath billowing in front of her and glanced toward the bell post at the village square. No one had rung it today. Good. She didn't want the others to notice her leaving. Not just yet. Let them think she was visiting the North Ridge for more bark bundles or a trade of herbs with old Rilma. Let them believe the fire simply needed rest. Hope was still easier than truth. She took the long path first, through the willow lane, where dew clung to each thread of her skirt. The houses here leaned toward one another, like friends sharing secrets. But even the windows looked tired, shutters closed against what used to be gentle wind. She passed the old yarrow house, where the paint had peeled back to wood, and paused at the last window on the left. There, in a ceramic bowl on the sill, a stub of candle sat melted into a pool of hardened wax. Alara smiled softly. Widow Mine's window. For 40 years, she'd lit a candle every night for the husband she lost on the riverbend. She said it helped her dream of him. Alara raised a knuckle to knock, but stopped. The candle hadn't been lit last night. She leaned in, her breath fogging the pain. No movement. A memory surfaced. Marn's laugh as she handed Alara a dish of thistle pie, her wrinkled hands brushing flour from her apron. That warmth, once steady as a sunrise, felt distant now, but not gone. She turned the latch and slipped inside. The house was quiet, not silent, but gently filled with the ticking of a clock and the faint creak of old beams adjusting their weight. A fire, small but determined, whispered in the corner hearth. "Marn?" Elara called gently. A rustle came from the back room. Then footsteps. The widow appeared, her long braid undone and eyes slightly puffy. "Elara," she said with mild surprise. "I didn't think... I was nearby," Elara offered quickly. "I noticed your candle." Marn sighed and walked to the sill. "I didn't light it last night. I forgot." That wasn't like her. Elara moved beside her, hand hovering over the wax bowl. "Do you remember when you first started lighting it?" Marn nodded slowly. "The first spring after Tom passed. The night the frost ruined the apple buds. It felt too cold, so I lit it." "It helped?" "Yes." She glanced toward the fire, eyes softening. "It made the house feel like he was near. For a while." Elara hesitated, then reached into her satchel and unwrapped a single ember. Still warm. "Marn, may I relight it for you?" The old woman stared, something in her eyes catching light. "You think it would still help?" "I think it remembers him too." Marn nodded. Together they placed the ember into the bowl, pressed it into fresh tallow, and watched as the flame leapt to life, trembling, then steady. The room warmed, not by degrees, but by something gentler. A quiet return. Elara stayed for tea, and when she finally stepped out again, a sliver of brightness cracked through the clouds. One ember found. The clouds shifted like wool being slowly carded, letting shafts of pale sunlight thread through the sky. Elara pulled her hood over her braid and followed the curve of the lane toward the hill crest. Each step felt surer now, as though that single flame at Marn's window had warmed the earth beneath her boots. Her next destination waited in silence beyond the edge of the village proper, where stone paths gave way to packed earth and the buildings thinned, becoming fewer, older. The forge lay there, stubborn and squat against a backdrop of pine. Its chimney had not smoked in over 3 winters. Elara paused at the heavy wooden gate. Its iron latch was rusted, the handle cold beneath her glove. She pushed. The gate creaked open, the sound stretching too long in the stillness. No one lived here now, not since Brannock passed. He'd been the last smith, a man of soot and thunderous laughter who forged not just nails and hinges, but warmth. Elara remembered watching him lift red-hot horseshoes from the fire with tongs like a giant's fingers, whistling as he worked, sweat streaking through the coal dust on his cheeks. Now, the air smelled only of damp stone and ash that had long since cooled. The interior of the forge was darker than she remembered. Shuttered windows, a thick veil of dust. She stepped inside, her boots stirring old straw. Everything lay where it had been left. An anvil, tongs, the whetstone, even Brannock's leather apron, still slung across a hook near the door. But the forge itself, the heart of this place, was cold, silent. Elara approached it, carefully pulling the covering from the coal scuttle. Black dust. No glow, no pulse. She knelt, brushing the surface with her fingers, then closed her eyes. "Is there anything left here, old friend?" She wasn't speaking to Brannock exactly, nor to the forge itself, but to something deeper. The echo that still lingered, if she could just hear it. She stayed still. Then, faint as breath, warmth. It came not from the hearth, but from the wall above, where a child's drawing, almost invisible beneath soot, showed a stick figure with wild hair, holding hands with a large, square man. "Papa and me," the charcoal read. Elara touched it lightly. Not just a memory, a moment, preserved in dust. She opened her satchel, drew out a fresh taper, and struck it against flint. The flame danced alive. She lit a scrap of dry cloth and placed it gently where the forge's mouth yawned open. It caught. The flame wobbled, then licked up higher, brighter. Elara added one of her embers from the central hearth, tucked in a sliver of birch bark, and fed it slow, patient breaths. The forge didn't roar. It sighed, as though thanking her. For a long time she sat beside it, letting the warmth soak into her bones. This place didn't need a full fire. Just remembering. Just being seen. When she finally stood, the drawing on the wall seemed brighter. She left the ember to burn itself out gently. No need for more. 2 embers, 2 lights returned, and a village flame waiting for her. Would feel them both. By the time Ilara left the forge, the sun had begun its quiet descent, spilling amber light across the village rooftops. The chimneys puffed lazily, and smoke curled upward like faded lullabies. The central hearth would be dimmer still by now, she knew, but she no longer feared its flicker. Not tonight. Her final stop lay past the west fields, where the new grain had barely started peeking through the frost-cut soil. Beyond the rise, nestled in a grove of birches, was the little camp circle. Not many knew of it. It wasn't marked on any map, nor part of the village's sanctioned trails. But Ilara had once stumbled upon it during a summer wander years ago. A ring of smooth stones around a pit, barely wider than a basket's base. Children had made it, she guessed, long ago, for secret marshmallows and whispered ghost stories, the kind of place where laughter stayed in the soil. She climbed the rise and spotted it, empty, untouched. The stones still sat in their quiet ring, one of them carved faintly with a sunburst symbol. She smiled. It looked just as it had in her memory, only dustier, colder. Ilara knelt and ran her fingers along the inside of the fire pit. Bits of charred twig, forgotten pebbles, the brittle remains of joy. She gathered a few, pressing them into her palm. From her satchel, she drew the last ember, nestled now among the folds of linen like a sleeping bird. She held it close to her lips and whispered, "Not a spell, not a prayer, just memory. I remember the warmth of laughter. I remember small hands gripping sticks. I remember someone singing off-key." She lit a thin bundle of cedar shavings, then the dry twigs. The flame caught quickly, not large but content. The scent of old summers rose with it. Ilara stayed seated beside the fire until the stars blinked into view, one by one, like eyes opening in the dark. She didn't need to stay long. The ember had done what it came to do. Before leaving, she placed a single flat stone near the fire pit, marking the moment. A new beginning laid down gently where forgotten joy had slept. She descended the hill in silence, and as she reached the edge of the village, she paused. Far across the rooftops, in the direction of the hearth house, a soft orange glow pulsed against the windows. Brighter, bolder, as if the flame had taken a long breath and remembered who it was. Ilara exhaled, her shoulders softening. She had gathered more than embers. She had gathered pieces of love, tucked away in quiet corners, waiting to be kindled again. And she would keep gathering, because sorrowful shadows still crept, but they could not stand long against the kind of light that knew where it came from. The next morning, the village stirred to a kind of hush, not silence, but reverence. People noticed it without knowing why. Bread baked warmer. The blacksmith's tools, untouched, shimmered with the faintest glow of heat, and the air, though still touched with winter's edge, carried the scent of cedar and old comfort. Ilara returned to the hearth house just after dawn. She pushed open the thick oak door and stepped into light, not the pale flicker of before, but a gentle flame, taller now, licking upward in calm rhythm. It filled the round chamber with a golden hue that kissed the walls, the benches, and the faces of those gathered. For she was not alone. 3 children sat in a circle on the woven rug near the fire, their cheeks pink from morning chill, their eyes wide. They were listening to Elder Bram, who had once been the village bell ringer and now spent most days tending his garden and telling stories no one asked for. But now he spoke with purpose, his voice low and worn, as though shaped by the fire itself. And when the shadow crept too far, the keeper didn't fight it with swords or shouting. She found the quiet flames, forgotten but never gone, and carried them back in her hands. Ilara blinked. He smiled when he saw her. "We were just talking about you." The children turned. One of them, a boy with straw-colored hair and an untied boot, stood up suddenly. "Did you really go to the ghost forge?" "It's not haunted," said Ilara with a soft laugh. "Just lonely." "Is that worse than haunted?" asked the youngest girl, frowning. Ilara knelt beside them. "Sometimes. But loneliness can be warmed. Hauntings take more work." Bram chuckled, and the fire crackled behind him like it agreed. She looked around. More villagers were drifting in now, drawn by the warmth, or perhaps by something deeper. Widow Marn, walking with steadier stamps than usual. Rilma from the North Ridge, carrying a bundle of mint tea. Even the baker's apprentice, who never woke before mid-morning, shuffled in with a sweepy grin. No one said anything formal, no declarations, but one by one, they found places near the hearth. Someone brought a stool. Someone else passed around honeyed oatcakes. Children sat closer, shoulders brushing. Ilara sat quietly, watching the fire. It was alive again. Not because she had commanded it, but because she had listened. And in the listening, in the gathering, it had remembered. She pulled out the keeper's ledger from her satchel and began a new page. Day of return, she wrote. The hearthlight breathes again. She paused, then added. Flames found, 3. Hearts stirred, too many to count. She smiled. The fire advanced. That evening, as twilight dipped the village in violet and slate, Ilara remained at the hearth house longer than usual. The fire was strong now, not roaring, but alive in a way that felt aware. It flickered brighter when someone laughed, and gentler when a child leaned against their parent's shoulder. It responded, not to wood or kindling, but to presence. After the last visitor left, leaving behind a still warm mug and the faint scent of cinnamon, Ilara rose from her place near the fire and stepped outside. The village was quiet again, but not in mourning. It was a restful quiet, a wintered peace. She wandered toward the hill at the village's edge, where the elder trees grew tall, their trunks wrapped in ivy and moss. Here, generations of keepers had etched small symbols into the bark. Spirals, flames, suns. A private ritual, a silent vow. Ilara traced a finger along her grandmother's mark, a flame inside a circle ringed with stars. "You be glad," she whispered. "It's remembering again." She didn't expect a reply. The trees were not magic, but the wind passed softly through the branches, and it felt approving. Then, footsteps behind her. She turned quickly, her hand dropping to the pouch at her side. But it was only Bram, leaning on his cane. "Thought I'd find you here," he said, voice gravel soft. "You always were the quiet one." "I like it better this way," Ilara replied. "I know. That's why you were chosen." She tilted her head. "I wasn't chosen. I was left. After grandmother passed, no one else wanted to tend the hearth." Bram smiled, the kind of smile that knew more than it said. "And yet, the flame waited for you, didn't it?" She didn't answer, but she didn't argue either. He looked toward the trees, his gaze falling on the symbols. "When I was a boy," he began, "the hearth fire went dim too. Not for long, just a flicker. My mother said it happened when people stopped listening to each other." Ilara's brow furrowed. "I thought it was just stories." "Most stories are warnings dressed as comfort." They stood in silence, the moon beginning to rise behind the trees, casting silver along the bark. "Will it stay lit this time?" she asked. "That depends," Bram said gently. "Will you keep listening?" Ilara nodded, then added, more softly, "And will they?" He didn't answer, just gave her a long look, then turned back down the path toward the village. Alone again, Ilara crouched near the roots of the old flame tree and pulled a small carving blade from her belt. She found a smooth spot near the others and pressed the blade gently into the bark. A flame, encircled, and beneath it, a tiny ember still rising. She stayed until the stars shone clear, then walked home with the fire warm behind her and 1,000 unspoken embers waiting in the hearts of those who would come tomorrow. The next few days unfolded like pages turning slowly in a cherished book. One morning brought fresh loaves from the baker's son, who left them beside the hearth with a scribbled note, for those who forgot to eat. Another day, 2 children snuck in before dawn and tucked sprigs of dried lavender into the cracks between hearthstones. Ilara never scolded. Instead, she added the sprigs to the fire. It crackled sweetly in thanks. And then the visitors started sharing stories. At first, quietly. A whispered memory here, a hesitant confession there. An old man spoke of the wife he lost 20 winters ago. A girl recounted how her brother used to carry her on his shoulders through summer rain. Each tale stirred the fire, just slightly, but enough to notice. The light responded with something like breath, like heartbeat. Ilara wrote it all down in the ledger. Not names, not dates, just the feeling of each flame. Grief soothed by memory, loneliness lifted through laughter, a silence broken with song. It was working. But then, on the 7th morning, she found the hearth dimmed again. Not cold, not gone, but flickering in uneven bursts, like a flame caught in a wind no one could feel. She knelt, concerned. "You're tired again?" She thought she had given enough, gathered enough, but something in the fire's slow pulse said no. Elara touched the stone rim, and this time she listened deeper. Not to the flame, but to what was missing. Not joy, not warmth, hope. The ember of something not yet seen. She stood slowly, then walked to the far end of the hearthhouse, where a dusty wooden chest sat beneath the window. She opened it. Inside lay scraps of parchment, folded notes, and bits of string-bound whiffs, left by villagers in quieter years. Hope letters, her grandmother used to call them. Wishes not spoken aloud for fear they'd vanish. Elara hadn't opened the chest since she was a girl. She reached inside, pulled out a yellowed scrap, and unfolded it. "I want to believe my father will come home." Her chest tightened. She read another. "Let my sister find peace wherever she went." Then another. "I want to love without fear again." Elara swallowed hard. These were not memories. These were dreams, longings, prayers without names, and they still carried heat. She brought them to the fire, one by one, fed them slowly into the flame, not all at once, just enough for the hearth to remember what it was built for. And as each one curled into smoke, the fire grew steady again, not brighter, but deeper, more certain. A light that didn't just remember, a light that waited. By nightfall, the fire glowed with a new steadiness. Not the leaping joy of fresh kindling, nor the sleepy warmth of embers, but something stronger, resilient. The kind of fire that didn't need to prove itself. Elara sat beside it with the ledger open on her lap. The ink shimmered slightly in the firelight as she added a new line. "Dream embers rekindled. The fire listens even when we forget to speak." She closed the book gently. Outside, the wind shifted, not colder, but purposeful, as if carrying word of the hearth beyond the village itself. And that's when she saw him. A boy, no older than 10, standing just outside the open doorway. His coat was thin, patched at the elbows. His boots didn't match. And his eyes, wide, uncertain, watching the fire like he wasn't sure he was allowed to look. Elara rose slowly and walked to the threshold. "You can come in," she said softly. He didn't move. "I'm not from here," he said. "That doesn't matter." He stepped forward, cautious. "I don't have a fire at home." "Then this one is yours too." He stood just inside the doorway, hands shoved into his pockets. His cheeks were pink from cold, and his nose ran slightly. He didn't wipe it. "I was walking," he said. "I don't know why I came this way." Elara offered him a seat near the fire, pouring a cup of warm cider from the pot beside the hearth. He took it, hesitantly, then sat cross-legged on the rug. "I'm called Finn," he muttered. "Welcome, Finn." They sat in silence for a time, the fire crackling between them. He sipped slowly, his shoulders loosened. Then he looked up. "Can I tell you something, but just you?" Elara nodded. He leaned closer, voice low. "I hear things sometimes. Not bad things, just sounds. Like people humming when they're not there." She tilted her head. "Do you hear it now?" He blinked. "A little. It's in the fire." Elara smiled. "Do you want to leave something for it?" she asked. "Something to remember you by." He looked confused. "Like what?" "Something small, or quiet, or yours." Finn fumbled in his coat pocket and pulled out a marble. Not glass, stone, worn smooth. He rolled it in his palm, then handed it over. "My brother gave me this, before he left. He said it was the lucky one." Elara accepted it with care and placed it beside the fire, just at the base of the stones. The flames flickered, then hummed. Finn's eyes widened. "It's singing," he whispered. "Yes," Elara said. "And now it knows your name." He fell asleep soon after, curled near the fire like a kitten folded into warmth. And as Elara watched over him, she knew. Some embers found you, when you needed them most. Dawn found the hearth house painted in soft gold, The fire still burned, a calm, steady guardian. And beside it, Finn lay tucked in a woven blanket, his breathing even and light. Ilara sat nearby, head resting against the stone, her eyes half-lidded in that space between sleep and watching. He had not stirred all night. When he finally blinked awake, he rubbed his eyes with the heel of his palm and stared into the fire for a long moment, like making sure it hadn't vanished with the dream. Then he looked at Ilara. "It's still singing." She smiled, voice husky from sleep. "It remembers you." He nodded solemnly, as though accepting a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but understood just the same. They share a quiet breakfast of oatcakes and wild apple jam, spread with fingers instead of knives. No one else had arrived yet. The hearth house was theirs alone for a little while longer. Finn spoke little, but when he did, he asked careful questions. "Why do you keep the fire?" "Because someone has to." "What if you stop? Then someone else must listen for its voice. And if no one hears?" Ilara hesitated. "Then the shadows come." He didn't ask what that meant. But as they finished eating, he reached into his pocket again and pulled out a small square of fabric. Threadbare, faded red with a corner missing. "This was from my mum's apron," he said, not looking up. "I took it when she went away." He held it out. For the fire, to help it remember her. Ilara took it as gently as a breath and tucked it beneath the same stone where the marble rested. The fire accepted it without fuss, just a slow flicker of warmth, like a nod. Afterward, Ilara walked Finn down the path that led toward the southern edge of the village. A neighbor named Rilma, who had lost her own son many winters ago, agreed to take him in, at least for now. She barely asked questions, only offered him a bowl of soup and a second pair of socks. As Ilara turned to leave, Finn looked up and whispered, "If it forgets again, will you find more memories?" She crouched to his height, resting a hand on his shoulder. "As long as I breathe." He smiled, not wide, but real. And when she returned to the hearth house later that day, the fire welcomed her home with a quiet burst, like a sigh of relief. She opened the ledger. Flames remember what the heart refuses to lose. And for the first time in days, she let herself cry. The tears came quietly, not the kind that shook the body or begged to be seen, but the kind that welled up like spring water, slow, cleansing, inevitable. Ilara sat curled on the rug, the ledger still open on her knees, and let them fall. They left faint spots on the parchment, little salt rings beside her careful script. No one was there to witness her weeping, and that, too, was a kind of grace. She cried for the fire that had dimmed without anyone noticing, for the widow's candle and the silent forge, for the forgotten campfire ring and the boy with unmatched boots, for the people who had given so much of themselves they no longer remembered they had warmth left to give. She cried for herself, too, because sometimes even the keeper needed to be held. When the last tear dried on her cheek, the fire shifted again, just slightly. A curl of smoke formed the shape of a ribbon, a flicker pulsed like a heartbeat. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Ilara sat taller. That afternoon, more villagers came than usual. Word had spread about the fire's return, and people arrived not with questions, but with offerings. A faded scarf from a mother's drawer, a wooden toy with a missing wheel, a broken locket with no photo inside. No one explained. They simply knelt, placed the item near the flame, and sat quietly, watching. Ilara didn't ask for names, but she recorded each offering in the ledger with a brief description and one feeling: hope, regret, wonder, gratitude. One by one, the hearth grew stronger, not brighter or louder, but wider somehow, as if it was making room. And then a curious thing happened. The fire began to hum. Not a sound she could hear with her ears, exactly, but she felt it in her chest. A resonance, like the low note of a distant bell, or the vibration of a string pulled taut. Every time someone sat and placed their heart beside the flame, the hum deepened. It became a song no one sang, but everyone remembered. That evening, Ilara stood by the hearth, and looked out at the gathered faces. Young and old, tired and mended. They weren't just warming themselves anymore. They were keeping it too. And for the first time since the fire had flickered thin, she didn't feel alone in the tending. The village remembered. The flame would not fade. Not while it had this many hearts to hold it. Winter deepened. Frost etched its silver script across windows each morning, and the pond beyond the mill froze into a mirror of the gray sky. Snow came in quiet whispers, dusting the roofs and settling in the hollows of boots left too long outside. And still, the fire burned. Ilara began to notice something new. The way people lingered. The baker's wife, once brisk and bustling, now paused at the hearth after her deliveries, rubbing her hands slowly near the flame. The blacksmith's apprentice, once sullen and silent, now told stories. Small ones, silly ones, but told with a smile. The fire had become more than warmth again. It had become center. Every ember Ilara had gathered, the widow's candle, the fortis breath, the child's marble, seemed to live within it now. Not just his memory, but his melody. The hum was real, felt in the spine, in the pause between words, in the way people met each other's eyes and didn't look away. Then, one morning, the bell rang. Not the evening chime or the harvest call, but the bell at the village gate. Few used it anymore. It had rusted from disuse, and the road beyond it led only into forest and fog. Travelers were rare. Ilara was standing at the hearth when the sound came. She froze. The bell rang again. Once, then silence. She hurried outside, cloak swirling in the wind. A figure stood at the gate, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, taller than most, face hidden beneath a hood dusted with snow. A pack on his back, a staff in one hand. Ilara approached slowly. "Are you lost?" she called. The man looked up. His voice was low, hoarse. "No, just finished." She frowned. "Finished with what?" "Wandering," he said, stepping forward. "Looking for warmth that doesn't ask me to pay for it." That struck something deep in her. "You found it," she said, simply. He nodded. "I've heard there's a fire here, one that remembers." Ilara hesitated, then smiled. "Come, let it remember you." He followed her without question. When they reached the hearth house, he paused at the threshold, just as Finn once had. His breath caught when he saw the fire, as if he hadn't known how much he needed it until it was right before him. He walked to it, slow and reverent, then sank onto the rug with a sigh that came from a place deeper than lungs. Ilara offered him tea. He accepted without a word. They sat in silence. After a long while, he looked at her and said, "I left everything behind." She nodded. "But something brought you here." "I don't even remember what I'm hoping for anymore." Ilara looked into the fire. "Then let it hope for you until you remember." And the flame, hearing even that, gave a single, soft pulse of light, like a heartbeat between strangers. He stayed. Not forever, not yet, but longer than most visitors did. His name was Kale, and he spoke like a man who'd forgotten how language worked in warmth. His voice carried the cadence of frost-covered paths, of days without conversation. But slowly, around the fire, he began to thaw. Ilara noticed it first in his hands, the way they stopped trembling when he wrapped them around a cup. Then in his posture, shoulders loosening, spine no longer curled in defense. And finally, in his stories. They came out in pieces, not full tales, but fragments. A village that lost its river, a mother who buried every letter she wrote, a boy who followed birds because they never lied. Ilara didn't press. The fire did the listening. Kale helped when he could, chopping kindling, fixing loose stones around the hearth, carrying buckets of snow to melt for water. He didn't ask for a bed, just curled near the hearth with his pack beneath his head. And when he slept, he whispered names under his breath, none of which Ilara recognized. But the fire did. One morning, she found him sitting alone in front of the hearth, a worn piece of cloth in his lap. It was embroidered, but the thread had faded with time. He was running his fingers along the edge, over and over. "My sister made this," he said without prompting. Before the sickness took her voice, "I used to think, if I carried it long enough, I'd find a place where she could speak again." Ilara sat beside him. Maybe she just needed someone else to speak for her, she said. He looked at her, eyes red but steady. May I? She asked. He nodded. Elara took the cloth gently and placed it near the hearthstone, beside the widow's ribbon and the child's marble. The fire shimmered, not brighter, but clearer, as though the light knew the thread by heart. Cale exhaled. It's strange, he said. I've walked through forests, climbed peaks, wandered cities, but this fire, this small circle, feels larger than any of them. Because it doesn't ask you to earn its warmth, Elara replied. It just asks you to stay. That day, Cale didn't return to the guest quarters or to the edge of the village. He remained by the fire as the snow fell gently outside. That night, as the village bells chimed the hour, the fire hummed a different note. Lower, deeper, as if it too had remembered someone. The hum lingered long into the night, a warm vibration, low and steady, as if the fire had taken a breath and was still holding it. Elara lay on her cot, tucked beside the back wall, watching the flames glow reach across the stone floor like fingers stretching toward dreams. She couldn't sleep, not out of worry, but out of wonder. Each ember, each offering, each story laid at the hearth's feet. They weren't just fuel. They were becoming something together. Not a fire, but a memory that refused to die. She rose quietly and added a fresh log, though the flame hadn't asked for it. The fire caught it easily and gave off a scent of pine and honey, an unexpected sweetness. Cale stirred from his blanket near the hearth. His eyes opened, blinking against the light. You don't sleep much, he murmured. I sleep when the fire lets me. He pushed himself up to sit, running a hand through his unkempt hair. You talk like it's alive. Elara looked at him, the glow softening the tired angles of his face. You still think it isn't? He hesitated. I used to think a fire was just fire. Heat, burn, gone. And now? He glanced at the stone where his sister's cloth rested. Now I think maybe it listens better than I ever did. Elara offered a quiet smile. Most people speak to be heard. But some things, some places, wait for you to hear them back. The silence that followed was comfortable, shared. Then Cale asked, Has it ever gone out? She didn't answer right away. Her fingers brushed the ledger's leather spine beside her. Once, she said. Long ago. Before I was born. The story goes, the keeper at the time grew ill. No one tended it for 3 days, and the flame died. Cale frowned. What happened? They buried the ashes. Not because they gave up, but because they believed the fire would rise again. Just not yet. And when it returned, weeks later, it lit itself. No spark, no flint, just woke up again. Why? No one knows, Elara whispered. But I think maybe someone loved it enough from far away. Cale stared into the flame. Is that how it works? Love from far away? Sometimes. He nodded slowly, then softer. I hope she felt it. My sister. All those years. Elara placed a hand over his. She did, and now so does the fire. They sat there until dawn, not waiting for answers, just listening to a light. Snow fell heavy the next morning, muffling the village in white hush. The usual clatter of carts and footsteps was gone, replaced by quiet voices and the rhythmic sweep of brooms clearing paths. Inside the hearthhouse, the fire burned brighter than usual. Not loud, not wild, but with a kind of deep-rooted certainty, like it had remembered its purpose, and was now remembering its strength. Elara brewed a pot of rosemary broth and handed out bowls to the cluster of early arrivals. Rilma with her basket of dry herbs, Bram with his ever-growing stack of riddles for the children, 2 sisters who stitched side by side in silence, passing needles like secrets. Cale joined the effort quietly. He had become a fixture now, not in the way that drew attention, but the way stones settle into a stream, undisturbed, steady, essential. When the latch to the hearthhouse jammed, he repaired it. When the chimney fluttered with soot, he climbed up without a word. Elara didn't ask him to stay, but he did. And each day, he gave the fire something. Not always an object, sometimes a word, a name, a memory spoken only once. The flame responded differently to each gift. A pulse, a flick, a shift in hue. Elara recorded each in the ledger like a translator deciphering a forgotten language. And then, on the 12th night since the Ember Quest began, a child who had never spoken spoke. Her name was Avon. She was 7 winters old, and no one had ever heard her voice, not even her parents. Some said she was born without words. Others said the words had fled from her early on and never returned. She came often to the hearth house, always carrying the same button-eyed doll. That night, she placed the doll beside the flame, wrapped in a scrap of flannel. Then she sat, legs crossed, hands folded. The fire flickered once, then shimmered. And softly, barely more than a whisper, Avon said, "She's cold. Can the fire keep her warm now?" Every head turned. Her mother burst into tears. Elara didn't speak. She simply leaned forward and tucked the doll a little closer to the warmth. The fire danced, as if in answer. Avon smiled, and didn't stop smiling for a very long time. Later, when the hearth house emptied out again, Elara added a line to the ledger in trembling ink. Some embers sleep in silence for years, until one small voice calls them back. Word of the hearth house began to travel beyond the village, as softly and steadily as the fire's own hum. First came a merchant's daughter from the next town over, bundled in a coat too fine for the snow, her boots caked with road salt and pride. She brought no token, only questions, asked quickly, impatiently, as if the fire might produce answers, like coins from a pocket. But after an hour sitting near the flame, she stopped asking. She stared instead. Then came a man with an injured arm, who said nothing at all. He sat with his sleeve rolled up, the scarred skin lit by firelight. When he finally spoke, it was to say wanted to hate the world less. Elara placed a small stone, smooth and warm, into his palm. The fire flared gently. His shoulders fell. He stayed until nightfall. Every day now, the hearth house welcomed new feet across its threshold, some heavy, some hesitant, some without shoes at all. And every time, the fire greeted them without judgment. Elara watched it all unfold with the calm of someone who had long suspected this might happen, but never dared to hope. She had become less a keeper now, and more a listener, a quiet flame among other quiet flames. And yet, one evening, when she was alone again, she noticed something unusual. A letter. It had been slipped beneath the ledger. The parchment was coarse, the ink faint. She unfolded it carefully. "You do not know me, but I've heard the fire speaks in warmth and memory. I do not ask for shelter, only that you remember the name, Ori." There was no signature. No trace of who brought it, or when. Elara stared at a name for a long moment. It didn't stir a memory, but it stirred something else. She rose and walked to the hearth. From a nearby basket, she took a slip of cedar bark, scratched the name into its surface with the edge of her nail, and laid it gently into the flame. The fire pulsed once, then again, and then for just a moment, so brief she nearly doubted it. She heard a sound like laughter, deep and low and far away, not in the room, in the flame. "Ori," she whispered, "I remember." And she added to the ledger, "Even those we've never met live in the warmth we choose to carry." That night, the fire didn't sleep. Elara remained by it long after the last visitor had gone, her shawl draped over her shoulders, the ledger closed but still warm beneath her hands. The name, Ori, echoed faintly in her thoughts, like a bell tolling in the distance, familiar in its mystery. She had no face to attach to it, no tale to bind it with. But that didn't matter. The fire had responded, and that was enough. Outside, snow piled against the gores in soft, soundless drifts. The village lay tucked into sleep, windows dim and paths buried. But within the hearth house, the flame stood tall, its light a quiet sentinel. Elara watched it, eyes glassy with the edge of weariness. "You knew them," she murmured, "whoever they were." The fire shifted, not with wind, not with smoke, but with memory. a single coal broke loose and tumbled, sparking red, not random, intentional. As if offering her a path, she followed it with her gaze to the edge of the hearth's ring, where the old brass cauldron sat unused for months. Its blackened belly hadn't held broth since autumn, but something inside it shimmered faintly now. Ilara rose and knelt beside it, heart ticking faster. She reached in and pulled out a strip of waxed linen, wrapped around something small, round, cold, an earring, gold, dulled with age, a spiral design, the kind worn not for fashion but for meaning. She stared at it, stunned. She had never seen it before. It didn't belong to any of the villagers. She was sure of that. The fire cracked gently, not loud, but sharp enough to pull her attention. She held the earring closer to the flame, and the fire leaned forward. The flames didn't flicker, they bent toward it, as though drawn by recognition. Ilara gasped. Somewhere in the flames, for the briefest second, she saw the outline of a face, not made of fire, no, made of light, like a reflection in a stream, brief and soft and half-formed. But it was there, then gone. She sat back hard on the floor, heart pounding. The fire stilled. The room held its breath. She stared at the earring, cradled in her palm like an offering from the ghost. And slowly she understood. Someone had left this before, long before. Perhaps even before her time. Someone whose name had waited in the fire's heart, burning quiet until now. Ori, she whispered again. A promise? A vow. A memory returned. She added to the letter with shaking hands. There are names the fire keeps hidden, until someone listens hard enough to hear them call back. Ilara slept beside the hearth that night, wrapped in her grandmother's quilt, the earring resting on the stone shelf above the fire. She didn't dream, not of light, not of faces, but when she woke, she felt as though she had been spoken to. Not in words, in warmth. Morning came quiet and white. The snow had stopped, blanketing the village in stillness. Outside the hearth house, the trees bent under winter's weight. But inside, the fire burned steady, not flickering, not dancing. Steady, purposeful. Ilara reached for the ledger again, running her fingers over the latest entry. She'd always thought the ledger was a book of the fire, its moods, its reactions, its rhythms. But it was more than that. It was a map. And maybe, she thought, the earring was part of a trail. She wrapped it in fresh cloth and tucked it into her satchel, just beside her embers. Then, for the first time since she had returned from her ember gathering, she left the hearth house without telling anyone where she was going. The village still slept. Only a few windows glowed, and the bell-post stood silent. She walked past the square, past the empty fountain, toward the southern path. The trees opened into thickets dusted with frost, and her boots sank with each step. She was not certain where her feet were leading her, only that they must. She passed the ridge where Finn had first arrived. The memory of his small form in the snow made her clutch her satchel tighter. Past the hill where the children once played campfire games, past the now cold forge. And then she reached a place she hadn't been since she was a girl. The Forgotten Hollow. A grove left alone for decades, tucked behind thorn and pine. Her grandmother used to warn her away from it, saying it was a place too quiet to trust. But Ilara knew better now. Quiet places listened. She pushed through the branches, their thorns snagging her cloak, until she emerged into a clearing. There was nothing remarkable about it. Just snow, trees, silence, until she saw the stones. Half-sunken, lichen-covered, scattered in a circle. Not natural. A hearth. Old, broken, but unmistakable. Ilara dropped to her knees, brushing snow from the rim. It had once been wide enough for gatherings, wide enough for memory. And there at the center, blackened rock, fractured but intact. She touched it, still cold, but not empty. She pulled the earring from her satchel and held it toward the stone. The wind stilled, and the rock beneath her fingers pulsed with the faintest echo of heat. She closed her eyes. The name rose in her mind like steam. Ori. This had been their hearth, and it had waited all this time. Ilara knelt in the heart of the forgotten hearth, her breath ghosting into the cold air. Beneath her gloved fingers, the fractured stone hummed faintly, like something asleep but dreaming. Ori, she whispered the name aloud, not as a spell, but as recognition. And when she did, the wind circled once around her shoulders, neither biting nor bitter, almost gentle. A breath from the past. She pulled a taper from her satchel, lit it from one of her wrapped embers, and held the flame to the center of the old hearth. Nothing happened at first. Then, slowly, the smallest tongue of fire took. It didn't leap or flare, it simply opened. A sigh of light. Alara added dry bark, coaxing flame like a parent waking a child who slept too long. The fire grew, not large, but certain. A flame that did not ask permission to live again. She sat back on her heels, staring at it. It was different from the hearth house fire. This one was older, lower. Its light ran deeper into the stones, and the heat it gave off wasn't just physical. It was emotional. Grief, joy, echoes of voices long gone. She didn't know who Ori was. Not really. But as she looked into the flickering light, she felt what they must have felt. Longing. Hope. A desperate need to leave behind warmth that would outlive them. And now, it had. Alara reached into her satchel again and pulled out the ledger. She'd never written in it outside the hearth house before. It felt almost like breaking a rule. But this page needed to be written here. Entry 142, the hollow hearth. Some fires go out, some are extinguished, but some are waiting. And when found, they do not rage, they remember. She sat there for what might have been hours, listening to the hush of the trees and the soft crackle of this new old flame. And when she finally stood to go, she didn't douse the fire. She left it burning. A flame rekindled, not by flint or spark, but by memory and love. She took a final glance at the broken hearth, now pulsing softly under snow and sky, and whispered, "Welcome back." Then turned toward home. As she walked, the wind no longer howled. It hummed, and somewhere behind her, the fire in the hollow answered. Ilara returned to the village just before dusk. Her boots crusted in snow, and the smell of smoke braided into her hair. The sky was streaked with rose and deepening blue, and the chimneys were beginning to puff as windows lit one by one, like stars blooming from the ground. She felt different, like something had shifted, not in her, but around her, as if the village itself had noticed her journey. As she stepped into the hearth house, the fire leapt once in welcome. It was brighter than she'd left it, the room already warm with the presence of others. Rilma was steeping rosehip tea, and Bram was telling a story to 3 children who clutched cups of cider with wide eyes. Kale looked up from his seat near the hearth. His face changed the moment he saw her. "You found something," he said. Ilara nodded. She crossed the room without a word, unwrapped the used taper from her satchel, and placed it carefully on the stone rim of the hearth. The flame bent toward it like a flower to the sun. And then it flickered. Once, twice, and for a moment the entire hearth house dimmed. Not to darkness, but to stillness. Every voice stilled. Even the air felt suspended. The fires spoke. Not in language, not in sound, but in feeling. Gratitude, recognition, and something deeper. Return. Kale stepped closer. "Ilara, what did you find?" She looked into the flames, her voice steady. Another hearth, older than ours, buried in the hollow. "Whose was it?" "I don't know what the names, but one of them was Ori." He blinked. "The letter." "It was waiting," she said softly, "and we brought it back." No one asked what she meant. No one needed to. The fire told them. And that night, the hearth burned higher than it had in 100 winters. It lit not only the room, but the street outside. People gathered to the square without knowing why, drawn by something ancient and wordless. The children played games in the snow. The elders hummed songs they hadn't sung in years. It was not a festival. No one had declared one. It was simply warns, remembered, shared, kept. And Lara stood in the doorway of the hearth house, watching them all, her hands resting lightly on the doorframe. She didn't feel like a guardian anymore. She felt like a bridge. And the fire, her fire, felt like a promise that would outlive them all. The following morning, Frost hung like lace on the edges of every rooftop, but no one seemed to notice the cold. The village moved with a lightness that Alara hadn't seen in years. Neighbors paused in the square just to speak. Children built snow creatures with absurd hats and scarves, gifted from laughing strangers. Even the crows on the steeple cooed instead of cawed. The fire had done more than warm bones. It had warmed memory. Ilara found herself busier now, not with tending flame, but receiving stories. People began bringing tokens daily, not out of obligation, but instinct. A bundle of pressed violets from a woman who had lost her daughter. A wooden spoon carved by a man whose father had taught him to cook over a flame just like this one. A cracked bell with no tongue, once rung on the night of a long-forgotten wedding. And Ilara took each one. She didn't ask questions, she only listened. And the fire listened too. With every offering, it glowed a little more patiently, as if building not height, but depth. And as the ledger filled, the lines she wrote became more like prayers than records. The fire knows the shape of a story, even before it's told. Today, someone offered forgiveness to a flame, and it accepted. Hope is an ember that survives even the coldest silence. Then one evening, a strange quiet settled over the village. It was not ominous, it was sacred. The fire dimmed slightly, not from weakness, but from reverence, as if preparing. Ilara sensed it immediately. She sat near the hearth, with her hands folded, her breath still. A moment later, the door opened, and Bram stepped inside, carrying something in both hands. Wrapped in a velvet cloth was a lantern, dented, burnt at the base, its glass fogged with age. He didn't speak right away. The room waited. Finally, he said, "This belonged to the first keeper." Gasps rippled from the gathered few. Ilara stood slowly. Bram's hands trembled, but he held the lantern out. It was passed down quietly, hidden after the fire first went out. Long ago, we feared it carried too much grief. But I think it's time. Ilara took it gently, unracking it as if unveiling a relic. Inside, a single wick remained, untouched, unlit. Ilara turned to the hearth. She touched the lantern to the flame, and it caught. Soft, gold, unbreaking. The fire accepted it, not as fuel, but as family, and the room breathed together. For the past had found peace, and the future had found its flame. The lantern glowed like a heartbeat in Ilara's hands. It wasn't a bright light, it didn't need to be. It glowed the way an old promise glows when finally kept. The flame inside pulsed in time with the hearth's core fire, and the two seemed to echo one another. Not as two separate flames, but as one fire speaking across time. Ilara turned to Bram. His eyes were glassy, his mouth pressed into a trembling line. "She waited," he whispered. "All these years, buried in ash and memory." Ilara gently placed the lantern on a pedestal beside the hearth, a flat-topped stone used for nothing until now. As it settled into place, the fire's glow rippled outward. The air shifted. Someone near the door let out a soft gasp. The flames cast shadows on the walls, but not ordinary ones. They moved in patterns, swirls, like spirals of wind, or curling ink, like dancing, or storytelling. One child stood and traced the shapes on the floor with her finger. "It's like the fire is drawing," she murmured. Another answered, "No, it's remembering." Kale stepped forward, brows furrowed with something between awe and confusion. "Ilara, what happens now?" She didn't answer at first. Her hand rested on the lantern, warm through the brass. Then she said, "Now we keep listening." The crowd didn't cheer. There was no applause, but every person in the hearth house stood still with the same posture. Shoulders a little softer, heads slightly bowed, as if attending a silent service. The room wasn't full of villagers. It was full of keepers. And Ilara realized, with a strange thrum in her chest, that her role had changed again. She wasn't the only one tending the fire anymore. She had taught them hell. That night, as the fire glowed steady and the lantern pulsed quietly at its side. Elara opened the ledger to a fresh page. Her handwriting was slower now, more certain. Today, the first keeper came home. We didn't resurrect a fire. We joined it. She stared at the ink until it dried. Then, without closing the book, she lifted her eyes and whispered to the room, though it was nearly empty. Ori, wherever you are, we didn't forget you. Behind her, the fire gave a soft, steady glow, and for the first time in memory, no shadows lingered on the walls. Only light. The days that followed moved like slow music, steady, deliberate, filled with quiet notes that stayed in the heart long after the moment passed. The hearth house became not just a place to visit, but a rhythm to return to. People brought what they could: tokens, stories, silences. No one asked permission anymore. They simply entered, found their place, and shared warmth as naturally as drawing breath. The lantern stayed lit. Always. Its glow never faded, never sputtered, never asked for tending. It was as though the fire inside it was beyond fuel, beyond time. A memory so strong, it had become permanent. Children began calling it Ori's light. Elara never corrected them. Each evening she would sit beside it, the ledger open in her lap, and write down the day's echoes. One entry read, "A boy today placed his broken slingshot at the fire's feet. He said he didn't need to hit things anymore. He only wanted to build." Another, "A woman stood in silence for an hour, holding her wedding ring between two fingers. She didn't speak, but the fire knew." And still another, "A stranger from the west carried nothing but a whistle carved from bone. He played one note before placing it into the coals. The flame responded with a song I'd never heard before." Elara's hands ached from writing, but she didn't stop. She felt deep in her bones that this wasn't just record-keeping anymore. It was preservation. The fire was not just warmth now. It was a witness. Then, one morning, she found a folded letter beside the hearth. No name. Just a small sprig of lavender pressed between the pages. The note read, "You once said the fire hooks for us when we forget how. I remembered last night. Not everything, but enough. Thank you." Elara didn't know who had written it, but as she tucked it into the ledger and watched the lavender crumble gently into the page, she knew this. The fire didn't need names to love what it kept, and neither did she. Spring came slowly, as it always did in the hills, one thawed path at a time. Snow melted from the eaves in lazy drips. The wind softened. Buds pushed bravely through the frost-hardened soil. The fire remained steady, unchanged by season, but Elara noticed that its light seemed to reflect the greening world now. Brighter in the mornings, gentler at dusk. People still came, but not just to leave their memories. They came to sit, to mend, to begin. A girl with ink-stained hands started sketching by the hearth, capturing the curve of flame, the tilt of shadow. An elderly man carved tiny birds from birchwood and lined them across the windowsill. A woman, once silenced by grief, began teaching songs to children in the corner. Old melodies, reborn. Elara watched, the ledger always open beside her, its pages now so thick with memory that the binding swelled and creaked. She could feel it, the shift. The fire was no longer just a center of healing. It had become a center of becoming. Then, one morning, Kale met her at the door. He held a piece of folded parchment and a small pouch of herbs tied with string. "I think it's time," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. She nodded. "You're leaving. I don't think I'm meant to stay anywhere forever, but I'll carry the fire with me. I know that now." She handed him a carefully wrapped coal, still warm, drawn from the edge of the hearth that morning. "Then carry it with care. It remembers more than you do." He smiled, took it, and tucked it into the pouch. "And if I find a place that's forgotten itself, light it," she finished. Kale looked around the hearthhouse one last time, breathing it in. "It's not just you anymore, you know. This whole village, they're keepers now." Elara's throat tightened. That was always the hope. He leaned in and kissed her cheek, softly, reverently, like someone saying goodbye to something sacred. Then he stepped into the morning, vanishing down the path that once brought him to her door. She watched until he was gone, then turned back to the fire. It flickered once, like a farewell wave, and she whispered, "Watch over him." The flame pulsed, answering. With Kale's departure, something shifted, not in sorrow, but in balance. The hearth house no longer felt like it needed Alara at its center every hour of the day. Others had begun to tend the fire without instruction. They added logs, coaxed the embers, told stories. Some even began writing in small journals of their own, reflections of the ledger. Alara watched this quiet spreading of the flame with awe. One afternoon, she sat beneath the old willow just beyond the east field, a spot where the sun lingered longer than anywhere else. The ledger lay open in her lap, but she didn't write. She was listening. The wind carried voices from the hearth house, a lullaby, a burst of laughter, a creak of the door. Someone had placed bells on the beam above the threshold, and they rang gently each time a visitor arrived. She smiled. The fire was breathing now in more than just one room. She closed the ledger and stood, brushing leaves from his skirt. Her fingers lingered over the leather binding a moment longer than usual. So many names. So many silent flames reignited. She looked to the village and thought, what happens when the keeper no longer needs to keep? Not because the fire is gone, but because it is everywhere now. That evening she returned to the hearth house and found a girl, no older than 10, sitting by the fire with her palms open over the warmth, whispering something under her breath. Alara sat beside her without a word. After a moment, the girl turned. Do you think the fire remembers people who were never born? Alara blinked. What do you mean? My mom says I was supposed to have a brother, but he didn't make it. She never talks about it, but she cries when the snow falls. Alara placed a hand over the girl's. Yes, I think the fire remembers even those we don't have words for. The girl nodded. Good, I told it his name. Alara looked into the flame. It had softened, flickering in slow waves. What was his name? Ren. Alara opened the ledger and wrote with careful hands. Some names never echo aloud, but the fire holds them anyway. Ren. When she looked up, the girl was smiling at the fire, not needing anything more. And Alara knew the keeping would continue, because others had learned to carry the light. The next morning dawned golden, with the kind of sunlight that made even the frost look warm. It streamed through the windows of the hearth house, catching in the threads of tapestries, pooling in the folds of shawls draped over benches. The fire, as always, was already awake. Alara entered quietly, arms full of fresh lavender, rosemary, and pine boughs gathered from the ridge. The scent of green filled the room as she wove the herbs into a wreath and hung it above the firestone, where smoke wouldn't reach, but warmth could rise. The wreath wasn't for decoration. It was a blessing. That day marked 1 full year since the fire had dimmed, since the quiet flicker on that cold morning sent Alara on her ember quest. Since she'd gathered warmth from lonely places, whispered names into flames, and rediscovered the hearts of people who thought theirs had gone cold. A year of keeping. A year of remembering. She sat beside the hearth, her hands folded in her lap. The ledger rested on small table beside her, a ribbon marking the last written page. Visitors came and went, all unaware of what the day meant. The woman asked for tea. A boy spilled honey on the rug. An old couple sang a lullaby, in a language Alara didn't know. No one brought offerings. They simply brought themselves. And that was the greatest ember of all. When evening settled, and the last guest had left, Alara remained. She watched the fires glow, pulse gently across the floor, reaching into corners, lighting cobwebs, warming stone. Not a fire of need or even memory anymore. A fire of presence. And she whispered into the silence. I think you're strong enough now. The flames bowed low and rose again. She stood, opened the ledger to a fresh page, and wrote carefully. Her final entry. I was once the only keeper. But now there are many. The fire has no center because it is everywhere. It hums in windows. It sleeps in songs. It waits in quiet places. And still, it listens. She closed the book. And for the first time, she did not place it on the hearthstone. She left it on the shelf, waiting for the next hand to open it. Elara stepped outside. The night was crisp. Stars blinked overhead. The village glowed behind her, not from torches or lanterns, but from windows full of firelight. She walked without direction, just letting her feet follow the hum that had once been hers alone to hear. And in the distance, she saw a flicker. Another hearth, another flame, another story waiting to be kindled. She smiled and kept walking. The end.